in La Universidad Simón Bolívar in Caracas. She worked in the Presidential Disarmament Commission in 2011 and has been really engaged in advocacy around issues of violence, in particular armed conflict, for a number of years. She's a founder of Reacin, which is an organization in Caracas that works to both produce knowledge but distribute it among the wider population about ways in which to deal with issues of conflict resolution. And I have been incredibly fortunate to have been able to work with her for a number of years now and learn from her. And I probably would not have made it throughout my dissertation research had it not been for Veronica and all of the vinitos que tomamos en tu casa. I guess we'll just start off with, well, kind of to set some of the context. So for the past few years, Veronica and I and David Smiley, who's a senior fellow at WOLA and a professor at Tulane, have been working on a project to try to understand why violence has increased so much in Venezuela during the revolution, particularly thinking about the period during Chávez when poverty and inequality dropped significantly, but crime and violence went up significantly, which challenges a lot of theories that we have about crime and violence and the relationship between violence and poverty. So we've been working with him and just finished a book on the paradox of violence in Venezuela, trying to put forward kind of a framework for understanding the different factors that have contributed to increased violence over the past 20 years or so. And then more recently, we have been working with Francisco Sanchez as well, doing about 2 years of field work looking at armed groups in Venezuela, largely in Caracas, thinking about the different ways in which they operate, how to kind of map them across the city and what their relationships are like with the state, which is largely what we are going to focus on today. So to open it up, so just start with a question about if you can talk to us a little bit about how criminal organizations have been changing over the past few years, and particularly thinking about the way the state has responded to those criminal organizations to get us started.
So thank you so much, Becca. For me, it's an enormous pleasure to be here with you, and of course to be here. I have been also very, very lucky to work with Becca all these years, and with Leo and Francisco as well. So I thought it was interesting to speak and to tell you about the recent researchers we have done in Caracas. We have been focused in armed violence, and we have been dedicated to register all the transformations in violence that we have lived in the country. Lately, we have been paying attention a lot to all the transformations of what we call the post-Chávez period. But of course, we will say that all the transformations we have lived have, of course, a long history. Right now, Venezuela is having a new phenomenon that are called mega bandas or mega gangs. So it's important criminal organized organizations that you can situate in the south part of the country. So, and the geography aspect of the city has also been very important in the sense that all these gangs are situated in high hills that gives them strategic advantages over the police forces. So what we have been tracing is all these transformations of the gangs, starting from a period of massive incarceration in 2014. Of course, in the book, we speak about this paradox. Venezuela, we were experimenting very high, the richness of very high oil prices, and social programs were massive distributed. But it was interesting that we also pointed out that even if there were massive programs for people in the barrios or the popular sectors, young men from popular sectors were persistently excluded, even during the time where all the misiones were in the golden area. So there is this persistent exclusion of poor men in the popular sectors. And then in around 2012, the Chavez government started militarized operatives. So the citizen security was becoming more and more militarized. And then this is the stage that we called massive carceral punitivism. So to give you an idea, for instance, in 2009, we had the population in prisons were 30,000, but 2 years later, in 2011, we had 50,000 young men in prisons. So this was a very important turning point in the sense that we started to have a new phenomenon that is the organized gangs in the prisons. This trajectory is very similar to El Salvador. I mean, you can understand this in the frame of the wave of the mano dura policies that were very popular in the continent. So we started to have a new phenomenon of criminal organizations in the prisons that started to have more and more fluid communications and interactions with the gangs in the barrios. But then 2 years after, or in 2015, we have a new wave of militarized responses, and this is the period that we call the systematic killings. From 2015, we had what was called the Operativo de Liberación del Pueblo, OLP, where every year from 2015, at least 4,000 people were killed in the frame of police and militarized operatives. We did field work in one of those communities with also Francisco and Leo also helped us a lot. And it was unbelievably how during 2 years, massive police raids entered the barrios and killed young men and stole people's houses. And then, of course, like in El Salvador, the reaction was that the gangs started to make pacts among them and to have alliances and to confront a common enemy. And that is the time where in some interviews with certain police officers, they were speaking about the criminal conflict we were experimenting in Caracas. This was a period where it was normal to have hand grenades used during the confrontations with the police. So we were experimenting what Ben Lessing calls criminal conflict in the city. So at that moment is then when we started to have this confirmation of the mega gangs. And we started to have really organized criminal group of, for instance, 300 persons were together in gangs with centralized leaderships. So that's more or less the transformation.
Very good summary.
So it was also interesting to have Becca in the country, and I have been always very impressed by Becca doing fieldwork in Venezuela. So Becca, I would invite you to share a little bit about your fieldwork as well in Caracas.
Oh goodness, that's a big, so that there's a lot to talk about there. I think most of what Veronica and I discussed during a lot of the time that I was doing my first few years with the police, and which is why I wrote a book about sexual harassment and field work. Working with the police obviously can be very complicated. It's an incredibly masculine institution. So I mean, it's an interesting case to be, not just to be working as a gringa in Venezuela, just in general, but to be working with a population of men that are incredibly marginalized as well, because the police tend to come from very low-income neighborhoods and live in very precarious situations, while at the same time they're of course exercising a lot of control and domination over you as a researcher. So that has been an interesting process to work through for a number of years, but has gotten a little bit better. So I have talked with a number of researchers in Colombia. It's interesting to compare the differences in terms of how dangerous it is to work as a U.S. citizen in Venezuela as opposed to Colombia. And my impression is in some ways it's actually more dangerous in Colombia for a couple of different reasons. But so maybe we can transition from that field work into talking a little bit more about the article that we're working on, maybe in terms of thinking about as well the criminal governance and how it's related to how homicide rates have changed in Venezuela over the past few years.
Yes, well, also in the post-Chávez period with Maduro, we have the more and more militarized government. So to give you an idea, in 1999, the 10% of the ministers were military. But in 2017, 50% of the ministries were militaries. So it is a government where in the face of a lack of legitimacy from Nicolás Maduro, the more and more we started to experiment an authoritarian government. So Becca and I are working with the concept of neo-patrimonialism to understand the participation of the militaries and the use of coercion as a strategy of domination and governance in Venezuela. So what we are working right now is that to understand the geography and the distribution of different governances in Caracas. You have all this chain of barrios I was telling you, where you have criminal gangs. And it is very interesting to note that in 2017, where we had the elections that were very contested in 2017 of the Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, it's a national, it was a movement to rewrite the constitution. So it was also that year we had, to give you an idea, we had 9,000 protests that year. It was a very conflictive year. So that year it's very interesting because then the government did a pact with this important criminal organization to guarantee the pacification of that part of the city. So it is very interesting to study and to understand all the, following Nicolas Barnes, the criminal politics, in the sense that organized crime groups have become informal but very important political actors in the city, in the sense that they govern, they regulate the social life of the people under their control. There was a very clear sovereignty in these areas, in the sense that you could see all the borders of the barrio, and then you have an how do you say, un ejército de vigilantes, an army of young men who were surveillance. Supervision. So it was a clear sovereignty. And then it was interesting when we were doing our field work that people, the neighbors, use metaphors associated to the state to speak about the criminal gang. For instance, they say, oh yes, they are the judges here. If you have a problem with your husband, you do not denunciate it to the regular institutions. You go to the gang, and the gang has established a very sophisticated system of punishments. For instance, if it is the first time, they warn you. If it is the second time, they can shot you in your arm, in your hand. If it is, at the end, they can kill you. Or people speak about them as the ministers, because they have It's in a sense it's becoming more and more a sort of rational governance, in the sense that people knows they have how do you say presupuesto?
Budget.
A budget for social celebrations. For instance, during the Mother Day, there are celebrations and presents. So social life is really governed by these new actors. That is why we are using this concept of criminal governance, in the sense that they regulate socially, economically, and politically speaking the daily lives of the people in the barrios. And this is in this part of the city. But in other parts of the city, we have the more and more the visibility of other armed actors that are called colectivos. And of course, colectivos have a very long history. Becca is also writing this part of the article, if you can give some details about it.
So the article that we're writing right now is like, as Veronica said, kind of trying to think about the different geographies and both spatial relations between, not just between criminal groups, but so this is the way that Benjamin Lessing has proposed thinking about criminal governance, which is asking, so if we have commonalities between criminal groups that are engaged in criminal governance, we can still ask questions like, how do they govern, why do they govern, and for what reason? And that's kind of some of the questions that we're using to consider these two different armed groups in the city. So the mega banda that Veronica is talking about, and then the colectivos that I'll talk about really briefly. They have very different, again, it's interesting to kind of compare why they're interested in governing spaces that the state no longer governs, which is another aside, which I won't get into very much. But Venezuela is a very interesting case because it is becoming an increasingly, and has been for a number of years, an increasingly authoritarian state, which we tend to think about as a state that's incredibly strong, that controls its territory very well, that has a very intense surveillance network. And in the case of Venezuela, the state has become increasingly fragmented, incapable of controlling its territory. So you kind of have this emptying out of the state, and then the allowance of these armed groups to be able to take on state functions. And so it's very interesting to think about the ways in which this increasing criminal governance allows an authoritarian state to continue to exercise control, even if it's done through other organizations, right? And I did want to mention really quickly so in terms of thinking about criminal governance, this, of course, indicates there's a symbiotic relationship between the government and between criminal groups. But that relationship is very different depending on what part of the city that you're looking at, or even in what part of the country that you're looking at. So Leo has done a lot of work in more rural parts of the country. Those organizations look very different. And the consistency of the relationships between armed groups and the government look very different from place to place. And so the colectivos have an interesting relationship with the government because they were founded in the 1960s and the 1970s, so long before the Bolivarian Revolution, as a response to police violence, largely to state violence. So it was basically a way for communities to organize into armed groups to both protect their communities from police violence, but also from drug business, which was becoming much more common in Caracas at that time period. And so they had nothing to do with the state, or initially, actually, the state was incredibly repressive toward the colectivos. And a lot of them have had a very, and still have a very radical kind of leftist ideology, which is what kind of led to the transformation in relationships between the colectivos and the government with Chavez, because pre-Chavez, the government colectivos had a very antagonistic relationship. The state was very much so interested in eliminating them. And when Chavez became president, for a number of reasons that I won't go into, but he started to facilitate relationships with colectivos after 2002, and started talking about the revolution being armed but peaceful, indicating the importance of being armed for any threat that might be presented to the country. So during the Chávez government, he maintained these very clandestine relationships. Well, his government maintained very clandestine relationships with the colectivos, but in no way was it a very constant relationship. He oftentimes would critique the colectivos and called for a number of their leaders to be arrested. So they had a much more inconsistent relationship than what we have seen now with Maduro, who has become much more dependent on the colectivos to control particularly the western part of the city where a lot of the colectivos are. And so one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is where the colectivos taking over roles to be able to enforce quarantines, things like this, up until sometimes going out and shooting someone in public to make sure that people knew that they were willing to enforce the quarantine. And then the last thing I'll mention, because I've been talking a lot, the last thing I'll mention about the colectivos is, and this is true in the case that Veronica is talking about, given the humanitarian crisis, and because Venezuela is an oil nation, so therefore it imports a lot of its foods. I think it imports something like 80% of foodstuffs. Because of the economic crisis, food has become incredibly expensive and hard to access. So there's been mafias within the military and things like that that have taken over a lot of food control. But the colectivos as well are in charge of this in the western part of the city. So what we found in our field work is that food is much more profitable to control than drugs. So colectivos are much more interested in being able to control and distribute food than they are in drugs.
No. So we are interested in comparing the relationship with the state, the relationship with the population, the sense of sovereignty, and the economic activities of the different groups that control very important parts of the city. And what it is very interesting is that we have now a very important decrease in homicide rates. So what we are seeing is that we are having a more organized violence where violent actors are the more and more allied among them. So in the where the mega gangs are, we don't have any more small gangs in armed confrontations among them, but we have an important organized crime that works in synergies, and they distribute the market of drugs. So they work like a very important confederation of gangs. But in the northern part of the city, then you have these colectivos that are also allied among them in the Frente de Colectivo Sergio Ramírez to act also in planified and organized ways. So for instance, the decrease in the homicide rates is very impressive, taking into account that there has not been any citizen security policy at all, nor any transformation in the police forces. So we have in Caracas, for instance, the homicide rates have decreased from 40 in the 2018, 40 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, to 90. So you have a very important decrease in violence, but what we are experimenting is a more and more organized violence and more organized armed actors.
So one thing that I would add on to that is that it's interesting to see that in some cases, some of these gangs have become much more organized and much more capable of controlling territory within the same context. And this is something I'm particularly interested in. Within the same context, the police forces themselves have become incredibly fragmented, and there's a lot of conflict between them. So just as one example, on the highway that goes around the barrios that Veronica is talking about, I think it was last year, there was actually a confrontation between two different police forces, because one of the police forces was going to arrest a member from the other police force, and they actually began fighting on the interstate. And so it's become incredibly obvious how little state control has over even its own state security forces. I mean, there is this like intense conflict and fragmentation within the police. At the same time, the other armed groups are becoming consolidated.
Yeah, so it's for us, it has been really interesting to register all the transformations in the state relationship with the armed groups. So now you can see clear. We are thinking about in the area where the criminal gang is. We are speaking about alliances with the state, in the sense of this the impact these pacts have had in the lives of neighbors. But in the other area, we are speaking about, following Nick Barnes, integration, in the sense that the members of the armed colectivo, for instance, are part of the police forces. And I will end saying that, of course, Venezuela is going through a very difficult moment of humanitarian crisis, and right now we have all these international reports denouncing all the massive human rights violations police forces have done in Venezuela.
And so now we can open it up for questions. I think that was probably a lot of context.
I have a question about the data and the numbers. I find it very difficult to find data in Venezuela because the government doesn't really provide it, and when it can probably calculate it. So, for example, statistics were given about like 40 now, it's 19. But how are you guys collecting the data? Where is it?
Yes, it's a very important question. Thank you. Of course, since 2009, the government have stopped to publish data, and violence is a very important area. So they have really stopped to give information. But then you have different organizations that keep on registering and keep on following all the events, and the one that we are speaking is called Monitor de Víctimas, that is doing a great job with all the journalists going to the morgues of the city, and they are doing an epidemiological register of every death that comes into the morgue. They are registering, and then we have the definition of the different circumstances of each death. So we know that this, for instance, for us, it has been very important, and for these international reports, to have these kinds of organization working, because in some areas of the city between 2015 and 2019, the majority of the violent deaths were perpetrated by the police. For instance, in an area called El Paraíso, or the barrio where I was working, 60% of the violent deaths were perpetrated by the police. So you have the very, I mean, it is an admirable work these people are having. So, but it's a challenge. I mean, it's very difficult from working from the outside to have access to data in Venezuela.
There is one other, the Ministerio de Salud has data that they actually are very much more willing to share, but that data does not come up to 2021, I don't think, as of right now.
No, what has happened with that, because also the Minister of Health, it was one of the most trusty sources. But before, you have a retard of 2 years. Right now, 4 years. So it's very difficult to work with the health data, with the health statistics.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. It is excellent. I think it brings lots of questions to the existing theories of criminal gangs. It brings forward the grand theories to question that. I think it's excellent. I have two questions. The first one regards the negotiation or the process of making gangs and megabanda or the colectivos with the state. Why with this, what is it there for the gangs to gain, and why would the state listen to the gangs? Well, from the state side, I think it's quite clear that perhaps they lack the resources to do their stuff, but what is it in there for the gangs that they would gain in addition to like their authority basis? And what if the gang break the pact with the state? What would happen? Would the state still have the that power or that authority to reclaim whatever it claims?
Great question.
And the second question is quite related to the first one, that with all these relationships that you study, the criminal governance, what is the implication for the state, the Venezuelan state? How would you define the Venezuelan state? If we are to measure, for example, the strength, would you define it as a strong, weak, failed, or its very ability to negotiate indicates some kind of unique characteristic this element?
Can I go before you answer, please?
Yes,
that
sure.
Was like my first question, so it's made already. And the second one, I don't know if it was stated clear, and I didn't catch that. So I would like you to go over again the methodology. What methodologies did you use? Did you actually, and I don't know if Francisco did that, did you actually have the chance to talk to the people, or maybe to the integrants of the criminal groups? And since they're criminal, how did you manage to do that?
Okay.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about doing research on Venezuela in a general sense, and perhaps the difference of that, and both from the perspective of somebody based in Venezuela as well as being a solo victim.
Okay. Well, do you want?
No.
Okay. About the pacts, that is a very interesting question, also in the frame of what happened in El Salvador, for instance, that you had the pacts with between the criminal gangs and the government. So what happened is that there was in 2017 there was these elections, and then you had this lack of legitimacy from the government. So what we are seeing is that the government have started to make alliances and pacts with armed actors to have the territorial control of the city. So they rather prefer to make a pact with the mega gang than compared to the opposition, for instance. The political opposition does not want to take, the mega gang does not want to take the political power, but the opposition, of course, they want to take the state. So they are willing to make pacts with armed groups to guarantee the power of the state.
So really quickly, I'll also add that the way that some of these pacts originated were through what's called the zonas de paz, which were created by a vice minister who was very impressed with what was going on in El Salvador with gang negotiations. So there were pacts that started to be made through that initiative, but not implemented well at all. So it was a fracaso, as it always is with citizen security in Venezuela. But I did just want to note that there was kind of a positive intention to a certain degree in terms of thinking about how to actually reduce homicide rates by negotiating with armed organizations, but just implemented very poorly.
Of course, it was zonas de paz, so and that is the antecedent of 2017. So in this moment, if the gang get pacified, the police forces would not go into these zonas, the peace zones. And for us, the hypothesis we have is that this vice minister just heard about the PAC in El Salvador because it was the same period. And he started to use the same vocabulary because in El Salvador they speak about zonas de paz or zonas libres de armas, zones free of guns. So it was like he copied the example of El Salvador. And for the gangs, it was at the same time very profitable because if they behave, if they commit less spectacular and visible crimes, for instance, they did not commit any more kidnappings. Kidnappings is a crime that is spectacular, it generates social panic. So from their part, they were engaged in decreasing all the kidnappings, but then they were tolerated to have all the drug business. And they become indeed the most important hub of drug business in Caracas. It is this part. So for them, it was very profitable. And what we are experimenting right now, so it is a win-win alliance. So the gangs were governing in their spaces. The police officers did, after 2017, police officers did not enter this whole area, and they were responsible of even during the pandemic, they were the ones who were enforcing the quarantine, and so for them it was very profitable. What we are experimenting this year is the pact has broken. So in July we had again this war during the police forces and the gang that took all the city. I mean, we were in the middle of a conference and we had to start to, I mean, Francisco lived in that area, so he was like in a war zone.
Gunshots like 3 days.
He can tell you after. So, but right now the pact is broken. So we are in the middle of the evolution of events. So the gang has fled the country, they have left. Our hypothesis is that they are in Colombia. So, but that is an hypothesis. So we are in the middle of the evolution of the events. So just to synthesize, the government was in a period of lack of legitimacy, so they needed the control and the guarantee of the pacification of the city. And for the gang, it was very profitable because they could govern and have this tolerance for their drug business, and they have become really an important hub of drug in Caracas. Concerning the methodology, I can tell you the story of doing field work and especially ethnography oriented, because I was not living in the barrio. But I'm of course, to do this kind of work, you always have to have an ally or a partner that lives in the community. So what I did is that I got in contact with a community kitchen that was run by a social organization that is called Caracas Mi Convive. So I could go to the communal kitchen every week and do observations, interviews. I did a lot of interviews with women, but given the fact that during that period, it was after the pact, you could see all the youngsters of the criminal gangs around, even the leader, for instance, we could speak with him, and because he was, before the pact, they were hiding all the time. But after the pact, they were there, and I mean, you could see hand grenades, very currently, young guys were holding hand grenades in the neighborhood very openly. So, but of course, everyone said, and that is the very interesting thing about criminal governances, that you could feel safe. I mean, nobody will attack you, nobody will steal you, because the rules are very clear. So I could go there. I mean, of course, you're always afraid. It's not easy to see hand grenades near you, but you could be sure that you were not going to be stolen or attacked by by the youngs of the gang. So the important thing, as always, we do fieldwork is to have a contact that guarantees your safety, and the same contact guarantees you do not come from the police forces, or you won't threaten the gang. So when I was doing fieldwork, I was saying that what is true, I mean that I was writing the story of the police raids the 2 years before. And that was what we are doing. Francisco was also collecting stories of victims in order to have a track when justice comes to our country, we have registered what is happening in Venezuela. Becca can speak also about.
No, I was just going to mention that. I mean, the way that a lot of our projects have come about over the past few years was just a nice synergy of what we were working on. So I largely do a lot of the work with the police, but also with criminals, but young men who are engaged in criminal activity outside of the city. And so that, since when we started kind of bringing all of that data together, because we were discussing some of the interesting things that we were finding when speaking with each other. So I just say that to say it's a methodology that's kind of based in years and years of constructing relationships with different groups. We have multiple people who are working with on different aspects of collecting field work. And so kind of just like a melding of various various sources throughout and I think that's also important because less so now, but I think you were nodding your head when she mentioned something about not being affiliated with the police. I mean, it can get a little bit sketchy if you're working with the police and with criminal organizations, right? So I think it's been good in that sense that a lot of the division of labor is split along organizations. I think you had another question about methodology that you don't remember. Okay.
So it's very important, the networking issue, just to be safe and to guarantee that you are also a trustable person. But of course, you take also different measures. You go during the mornings, that is a little bit safer. You always say before you go, so people know that you're going to be visiting. And
I do think it's also, I mean, in a lot of cases, it is not easier, but it's more accessible to do some of the work being women because we present less of a threat. And they either, I mean, I think in general you're looked at as either a mother or a conquest, both of which mean that someone doesn't want to hurt you, most likely, at least not for a while. So that does facilitate, I think. I mean, that I don't mean that to say like it's easier doing the work because you're women, but it does open up it opens up networks in certain ways that being coming.
It's interesting because we have reflected about that a lot, and also it depends. The gender issue is very present. I totally agree that if you're a woman, it is easier to get in contact, but also it depends on the masculinity you represent. For example, it's very interesting if you compare, if you like to read ethnography, the narrative of a researcher such as Dennis Rogers, who did research in Nicaragua, or Philippe Bourgois that did research in Harlem. So Philippe Bourgois, it's very delicate. So the gangs thought he was gay, so they didn't feel threatened. But in Nicaragua, Dennis Rogers had to demonstrate that he was able to fight, to hang with the guys. So it's interesting, depending on the masculinity you perform, what kind of relationship you keep with your participants in this of your research. So being based in Venezuela, I will say that it's also very important, the issue of trust and having networks. For instance, the research we're doing with colectivos is because Becca has a person there that is
she has very long standing relationships with members from collective.
Yeah, so I am profiting of Becca's past with this, of trust, because everything turns around the trust issue. So that's why Becca says indeed that this it takes time to build relationships so you can access to them, to the field.
I worry about Veronica a lot being in Venezuela.
No,
Not necessarily actually because of the work that we do, but more for political reasons, more for political issues.
I will say that, well, living in an authoritarian regime such as Venezuela, I have not felt that I am in danger, such as journalists in Mexico. I think journalists in Mexico or social leaders in Colombia are experimenting at, I mean, 10 times tougher situation that writers or journalists in Venezuela. We, of course, you have cases of some journalists that have had to leave the country. But being a writer, it's true that we are the more and more prudent with our writing, and we have to choose every word we write and say. But up to now, I have not felt I've been, or I am threatened, not really. But of course, everything changes. So it's a very, I mean, you have to keep evaluating the context all the time. And you have to be very, and what we have developed is an ability to get together journalists, social scientists. For instance, we had a friend of the social organization that was threatened that he would go to jail because they were distributing money between the people from the communal kitchens, and then all the journalists, academics. So we got together to publish a comunicado. So we have developed collective strategies in an authoritarian government to react collectively and to call attention. So that has been useful.
And as far as being a researcher from the US, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. But I think just to kind of reemphasize what Veronica was saying, I've been able to spend a lot of time in the places where I work. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing the field work that I do if that had not been the case. And I worry a lot about students who are interested in doing ethnographic field work, given the way that funding in programs works. I mean, worked this way when I was in grad school as well, but it's increasingly so that there's just not enough time to be able to actually do preliminary field work, spend the amount of time that you need to spend somewhere before you actually start collecting data. And that's really important. And so I worry a lot about, and there's a lot of pressure, I feel like, for students to work on dangerous topics. So that you have these contrasting tensions, which is like, we're not going to give you the money or the time that you need to really prepare yourself to conduct this research, but there are all of these incentives, like academic incentives for engaging in that research. So I also took a very long time to finish my PhD for that reason. But it really, I think not spend too much time talking about it because there's a lot to say. But I do think, particularly, not even for a foreigner, I think even for someone like Veronica, because she doesn't come from the neighborhoods that she is working in, I guess I just can't emphasize enough the importance of being able to go somewhere and leave a site if you feel uncomfortable and find somewhere else to go. I think that's very difficult to do also. So being able to make smart decisions when you're in the field is a luxury that not enough people have. The other thing is just it's a really big pain to deal with the visa issues right now.
Yes.
This question may not be as pertinent to Caracas, but what sort of relationship do the Gobernanzas have with the ALN? And also, if you guys, if it's all right if not, but if you guys could speak as to the recent crackdown earlier this year against the parties.
Can you repeat the last part of your question?
Oh, earlier in the year, there's a crackdown government along the border against park dissidents. That was the main national news. If you guys know anything about it.
Okay. Well, Francisco can tell you about that because he does field work in the border of Colombia. so he can.
Maybe another time. I guess.
No, I mean for the future, you can speak with him about that. The the ALN. Well, I have not done research about the ALN. Of course, you can say they could be in Caracas, but their presence is not very visible. I work mostly in urban violence in Caracas, but the mega gangs do not have any. I mean, what we are starting to see is that the mega gangs, they are starting to go some members to the south part of the country where the gold mining is. But officially, I will say I have not traced for the moment like more structural relationships between the ALN and the mega gangs. But there are visiting. So, but they, if I understand, because that I have not been doing research about that, they go not the mega gang, but members of the mega gang. But I'm not doing research about that, so
it's hard to keep up with all the armed groups in Venezuela and even just in Caracas. But in terms of what happened earlier in the year, there are like, I don't even know if they're rumors. They might. I'm not sure if they've reached from rumors to truth, but there was some discussion about falling through between certain political actors, and that's why there was in kind of in a similar way that's what happened with gangs in Caracas. When there's a breaking of a pact, is when violence interrupt. But yeah,
because she gave interesting literature before. I can't help but see the parallels on this criminal governance with gangs in Brazil.
of course.
There are lots of books out there that I was assigned to read, and yes. And
Sorry.
I found that this, well, in addition to El Salvador, I find that this is quite a parallel. And yes, I just want to ask you too about this. Like, what are the similarities and differences that you find among Gobernanzas or the groups in Venezuela and say Comando Value in I couldn't remember the
Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the second question also about would you go so far to argue that the Venezuelan state has privatized these areas of the territory to
I think there was one on flavor. Did you guys ever hand up?
Yes, I understand you recently just in Caracas,
Yes,
or
I
mostly.
do outside of Caracas as well.
yeah, because sometimes like when the like general we say Venezuela, they can take place or take power and things like that. Sometimes you need to like abroad a little bit, think about other cities or because maybe the levels of the violence different in Caracas.
Of course. Mhm. Mhm.
So in order to like say some specific to do like a very specific case, it's not just in Caracas, it's like the level is high. Or,
Yeah, so in the
kind of level.
and rural areas are actually the areas that have seen the largest increase in violence in Venezuela for the past 10 years or more,
Yes.
for a number of reasons. But I will say the rural areas where I do work, is there are, I agree with very, well, it's difficult we were talking about how problematic this term is in class, but it's difficult as a Latin Americanist, right, to present, when you're presenting work, to know what geographic scale to talk about. But that's a different conversation. But in terms of the rural areas, there's been very similar. So Caracas was one of the main sites when Untitled was launched, but it was also in rural areas, not very far away from Caracas, but much more rural areas. And so there's been very similar changes in dynamics with gangs there, in that in certain areas, gangs have grown and become much more capable of combating the police, whereas in other places, and I think this is where your point is important, because this is also true in Caracas, that depending on what neighborhood you're talking about, the operativos that Veronica was talking about cause an incredible amount of conflict among gangs. So it's not, I mean, what you're saying is very important in terms of thinking about the different impacts. And this is something that Leo and I have worked on, but the heterogeneous impacts that state policy have on groups.
Yes, I will add that also, of course, it's interesting to compare between cities, but it's also very interesting to compare the different armed regiments you have in the same city. It's almost like a microscope you take and then compare the criminal governance of the mega gangs compared to the armed colectivos. So in the same city, you have very different micro-political regiments. So that is also very interesting, and that's we are doing, for instance, with colleagues from Brazil. And what we are writing, the article right now searches to, the journal right now searches to compare criminal governances in different cities such as Rio de Janeiro, Caracas. So we are all aiming to understand differences by comparing cities, but comparing the different geographies in the same city. And it is fascinating how in the same city you have very different micro-political dynamics. So it is also interesting to go deeply in the dynamics of each city. So yeah, so thinking about cities in Latin America, what is also fascinating is that what we are seeing in Caracas is not only in Caracas, but is a trend we are seeing in other cities. For instance, in Sao Paulo, where Ben Lessing's work, he's studying criminal governances of the PCC, el primer comando de la capital. And he also, our colleagues have also found that in Sao Paulo, the homicide rates have decreased importantly, not because of citizen security policies, but because the internal politics primer comando de la capital have developed. So it's what we are finding is that in Latin American cities, you are having the more and more particular sovereignties. And then in 2010, already Diane Davis was speaking about fragmented sovereignties in urban Latin American cities. So of course, in terms of what we are seeing, first, I will say that we have a general trend of the impact of mano dura policies. So in Brazil, in El Salvador, in Venezuela, you are having the more and more organized crime groups because they are getting more organized, more sophisticatedly, internally organizing to respond all these mano dura policies we had in Latin America since the 2000s. Thinking about El Salvador, that started with the mano dura policy, and then in 2005, the mano super dura policy. And then you have all these transformation of gangs to, important criminal organizations that then different governments have started to make pacts because they have become so powerful, and they are having such an important territorial control in the cities that governments are getting more and more conscious that they are important micro-political actors in their territories. Yes, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think there are a lot of interesting overlaps and parallels with some of the gangs in Brazil. I do think that, in Caracas, gangs have historically been incredibly small in comparison to other places. So when I was doing my dissertation research in 2013, police officers referred to large gangs as gangs that had members of like 15 or 20, and that was a large gang for them. Whereas now the gang that Veronica is talking about has an estimated 300 members, but it's incredibly new. So I mean, I think I just want to highlight that this is all very it's all developing, as of right now. So it's hard to see how much they'll look like those types of organizations in a few years. That my just like hypothesis is that for a number of reasons that gangs don't have the same incentives, I suppose, to expand in the way that they have in other countries, because even the gang that this mega banda is still located in a relatively small part of the city. So in terms of what's the word?
I don't know if you could say that the colectivos have certain resemblances with the milicias in Brazil, in the sense that these are armed actors conformed by ex-police officers or ex-firemen, and have certain association with the state, and they offer certain services to the population. So if you would like to compare, you could say that the colectivos are more or less have a certain resemblance with the milicias, and the mega gangs with the Comando Vermelho, el primer comando de la capital.
Right. So this is one interesting thing about the Venezuelan case that we've also been discussing more recently, which is, I mean, the pluralization of violent actors in most Latin American countries occurred after transition to democracy in a lot of places. And what we're kind of trying to think about right now is, what does it mean to have such a pluralization of armed actors in a space that is an authoritarian state that ostensibly will go through a transition at some point, hopefully. But so I mean, it creates a lot of challenges for thinking about what a transition would look like when you have violence that's so decentralized, whereas in Brazil and other places like the militias came out of security forces that were disbanded after a transition, right? So I mean, presents a very specific problem for thinking about transitional justice.
Organization, the state goes so far, not the state completely, it's the individual. It goes so far to argue because I still serving these groups that can things.
I'm not sure I would say privatized, because in a lot of these places the state never had much of a presence. So it's not like it was incredibly present and then rolled back. I mean, to the degree that police officers were more present in certain areas, yes, but I think it's hard to talk about a privatization if the state never really had, the state was never really fully present to begin with.
It's becoming more and more visible, the sovereignties they have, but they do keep some sort of relationship with the state. So for instance, the mega gang was there, and they were starting to behave this year they have become so powerful that they began to challenge more and more on the state. So then this year, the state, started a militarized operative and really massive invasion to this part of the area. So the mega gang had to fled. So of course the state, it's still a very, very important actor in the equation. But you can say that people are starting to live governed in their daily lives by these kind of actors. And you can see, of course, I very much like the concept of hybrid orders, that you can see how the state and the criminal or the armed actors have different synergies. So, Carlos.
Yes, well, first of all, it's so great to be together in a room.
Yes.
I'm so excited. And excellent presentation. I have a question. I mean, there is a lot of good publicity of the collectivos by some leftists. especially American leftists that say that they are a form of resistance, that Camaro can push Chavez beyond what he wanted. And the picture that you're presenting of the political is that they are controlling a territory, but they are sort of like a gang, right? So they are distributing food, but also, I guess, drugs and illegal things that we consider to be illegal. I would like to know more the difference between the colectivos and the mega band. And what is happening to the army? How did the army in Venezuela become so fragmented? It was during Chavez, I guess, and all of the conflict between the officials of the army and the rank and file. But I don't know. I mean, very interesting that you see the fragmentation and the fragmentation of sovereignty in an authoritarian state that leads us to the army. What happens to the army?
Yes. Well, it's very interesting your question because, and Becca has addressed also that in right now is that you kind of have people have this kind of vision of the Chavismo like a unit, a very strong unit, or an authoritarian government. But what we have been registering, and we tried to conceptualize it under the concept of revolutionary governance, is that under Chavez, the state, of course, became the more and more fragmented between, for instance, the opposition and the Chavismo. For instance, you have Caracas. At one time, you had like the government, the governor, that was one rank, one level of the government of the city. The governor was from the opposition. Then Caracas, that has 5 municipalities. They were some of some Chavistas and some from the opposition. And they were absolutely unable to coordinate whatever you can imagine. And of course, a city depends absolutely of communication and coordination. So that was one important fragmentation. But also among the Chavistas, you have also an inner struggle for resources or for access to Chavez, for example, that was like a very important leader. So there were these inner struggles between Chavistas to have access to Chavez, or to a very important competition for resources. So again, you have a very important fragmentation within the state. And without saying what the example Becca was saying about the police forces, I mean, to the point where you could see police forces fighting among them
in broad daylight.
in the street. So it is a very fragmented state. That what we are writing about is the delegation of certain functions to the colectivos in these parts of the city. So it is clearly a delegation of authority and of services. So, of course, the mega gangs and the colectivos have a very different history. Like Becca was saying, the history of the colectivo, they are
They've inherited, they've inherited a history from the left.
They inherited the identities of the colectivos of the 60s. So they have a very important leftist discourse, and they call themselves also movimientos sociales, social movements. So they do have, they do orient their work toward social activity, social organization. So that is, but also collectivos have become very heterogeneous. So you have those that have inherited the legacies and the fights from the past, that when you speak with them, they start to tell you all the humiliations and suffering they had in the Fourth Republic, in the Cuarta República. But right now you have very opportunistic colectivos that are formed by ex-police officers or police officers, that they are engaged with the deliveries of services in these communities, but also with all the business of food. So they have become also economic organizations. So first, I will say colectivos are very heterogeneous. Some of them come from inherited from the past, all the discourse from the left, but you have more colectivos that are more sort of vigilantists, and they have become an important economic networking around the food issue in the context of a humanitarian crisis. And the mega gangs, of course, are clearly criminal organizations, which its origins are in the prisons, and all this massive incarceration of the young men from the barrios, that you have this phenomenon. Of course, the mega gangs do not have any political discourse, and the colectivos, they do have a political discourse, and they are clearly loyal to the government. And what has happened that is also very interesting is that they have mutated to being the more and more legal and ingrained into different machineries of the state. For instance, the militias, the militias is the fifth branch of the armed forces, and they are formed by civilians trained to defend the revolution. So the colectivos right now, they belong to this figure, so they are the more legalized, or they belong as well to the Consejos Comunales. So there has been a sort of mutation that they have a legal fachada, but still they are armed. They charge vacunas to the vacunas are extortion to the informal business, micro-informal business that trade with food, and they clearly exert an armed coercion to the population. I mean, during the quarantine, if you had a little party, they invaded your home to stop the party. I mean, it's a very despotic armed governance we are experimenting in different parts of the city.
And yeah, and I would just add, in terms of thinking about kind of leftist intellectuals, which we know a couple of them that defend the colectivos. I think, well, it's very evident that they talk to colectivo members and probably not a lot of other. So I mean, a lot of repetition of the discourse of what the colectivo members think they're doing themselves, which is still what they say, that they're going to defend the revolution hasta la muerte because they don't want all of the progress that has been made by the Chavista government to go away. And so that I think a lot of that gets repeated by scholars from outside of Venezuela, because they rely incredibly heavily on one source of data, one narrative, as opposed to trying, I don't know, well, as opposed to looking for various opinions. And I mean,
try to find out what people who lives in the regular neighbor who lives in that neighbor experiments and lives under the regime of the colectivos.
I think that Alejandro Velasco has done a really good job. I mean, he's a historian, so he hasn't published anything about Chavez forward, at least not in his book, but he does a very good job of talking about the social needs that the colectivos filled originally and why they were popular, also thinking about the terror that they sowed, they created in the neighborhoods that they were working in. So it's a much more balanced.
Yes.
So first of all, said that the collectivos, as they rose into power and were more institutionalized, they had to appeal to social needs. And at some point, to my understanding, people had a certain interest in rooting for them. When the mega gangs, now that they're acquiring power, and also going to have to start it, they haven't to appeal to people's social needs. Have we seen any cases of this mega gangs appealing to the people? And then I had another question that you said that you have seen past information, the violent government transitions to democracy. We can see an increase in violence. Does that pertain specifically to democracy? the changing pressure and intensity of government?
So I can talk to the second question, and then Veronica can speak to the first. There's a whole body of literature that's looking at why democracies in Venezuela became much more violent after transition. But so I'll just give like one example to be very succinct. So Diane Davis does work in Mexico, and she does a really fantastic job of showing how once Mexico started to transition into a multi-party system, similarly the pacts that existed between the governing party and between criminal actors were ruptured, and so that leads to a lot of conflict and violence. But also because the police forces, in the same way they have in Venezuela, have pluralized in the country since the transition also, and you have the president who's in charge of one police branch, right, and then you have the mayoral office in charge of another police branch, and if those two are from different parties, in the same way that Veronica was talking about, this happened much longer ago in Mexico, but they don't have interest in working with each other, right? So you have one police force, like a national police force, that is beholden to, that owes its allegiance to one party, and then a more like municipal level police force, and they're all in charge of policing these areas, right? So that creates a lot of problems for citizen security policies when politicians have no incentives to work together. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
I will only add that, for instance, in Guillermo Trejo's work, thinking about transitions from authoritarian governments to democracies, he does the comparison between countries who have developed important processes of transitional justice and countries that do not. So what he obtains is that in countries where you have amnesties, you, after the fall of the authoritarian regime, you have a sort of epidemics of violence, because armed actors or police forces that have committed massive violations of human rights they still stay within the state, or they turn into criminal actors, or also all the balances between the police forces and the criminal actors are broken. So normally you have an epidemic of violence. But in countries such as Chile, for instance, or even Peru, what he says is that after serious processes of transitional justice, where there is a clear message that no human rights violations are going to be tolerated easily, you have, well, in Chile clearly, then you have an important process of pacification. I mean, you don't have these epidemics of violence. So it's interesting to think about processes of transitional justice, thinking about the colectivos, or even all the massive human rights violations committed by the police forces in Venezuela.
I was just going to tag on to that. This is something else that we've been thinking about with the issue of transitional justice. And historically, transitional justice and truth commissions have not been, they aren't prepared to deal with issues of criminal violence or criminal conflict. They're prepared to deal with political conflict. And so, because they cannot really deal with criminal actors, they just are not prepared to deal with criminal actors and hold them accountable or do any of the things that they're capable of doing with political actors. That makes it very, very complicated after a transition, because you have a number of people who are engaged in violent activities that weren't necessarily political, that are not kind of caught up in the transition process or the truth commission process. And so that's something that we're also trying to think about, is what would it look like for a truth commission to be able to expand its coverage, I suppose, but expand into thinking about negotiations with criminal actors, for example.
Yes. Has there been any cases, not in American history at least, where the government has to portrayal, maybe through democracy, as to bend a little bit their sense of justice to ensure the violation of human rights is broken. So can they implement more force for greater good, which for these police forces are pluralized force?
Well, ostensibly, that's what the mano de obra policies do, is they provide a lot of discretion to police forces. They amplify police discretion and basically cancel any kind of regulations on police use of force that might have existed previously. And so a lot of governments would say that that's what they need to do to protect human rights violations. That's a very common justification for why mano de obra policies are implemented, because we have to, I mean, it's a very biological discourse. We have to protect the good citizens or from the bad citizens, and that's worth taking lives because we're in a situation where there's nothing else we can do, basically. So it's a very, I mean, that discourse is very common to be able to justify mano de obra policies. And what's interesting about it is if you look at where mano de obra policies have been implemented, there's really more violence than before the mano de obra policies were implemented. Violence increases. One of the things that I've been documenting with the police is that even their lives are put in more danger. So really, mano de obra policies do not create security for anyone, not even the police forces that ostensibly they're empowering. But yeah, that is oftentimes the idea that is used to justify that.
I have a question. What about race? When we talk about mass incarceration in the United States, we know what it means in other parts of the world too. So how is that played in Venezuela?
Race. Race. Okay. Of course, yes. Venezuela is an interesting case to think also about race, in the sense that police officers are also dark-skinned, and they put into jail youngs that are dark-skinned. But of course, prisons are full of young, poor men and dark-skinned. But there is not officially a discourse of race, but of class. Class is very important. But of course, when you start to study, there is this intersectionality between race and class, because prisons are absolutely full of poor guys from popular neighborhoods. And but it's interesting because police officers, as I said before, are also dark-skinned. So it's very important, the class issue, I will say. And also politically, people get, there is a lot of protest and movements because of the killings to students during the protests. But the thousands of killings of young men from the neighborhoods, there is an astonishing and painful silence. So that's where we are also trying to advance, like justice for young men of the barrios who are the orphans of all the protests and denunciations. And there is this class issue that is very, very important in Venezuela. I don't agree or what?
No, yeah, I mean, just in general, people tend to talk much more in terms of class than well, as in most Latin American countries, there's a discourse of, you know, we're all of different mixed blood here, basically, what a lot of people say. So, and I think that's true in a lot of countries. So it's a lot of issues of race are papered over, I think, with class, and because class has become such an important category for like Chavista discourse, it's even less discussed. Well, and also because a socialist government doesn't want to admit that men of color are suffering much more under their government than previous ones.
And I will say that is also what is very important also in a city such as Caracas is the geographies of inequality. So you can see all these massive militarized operatives in poor neighborhoods, and nothing at all in the middle class neighborhoods, such as in Brazil, for instance, is the same thing. So it is really, and it's also interesting in informal talking, when people get to know each other, instead of asking or trying to read the social class of the person, people ask, where do you live? So it is a very strategic question to read the social class. So Caracas is absolutely a divided city and fragmented between the middle classes and rich and the poor neighborhoods. And that's where you have these more than 50% of the violent killings in these parts are committed by the police. So young people are not, and that's what we work in our articles. It's not like traditionally the poor, dark-skinned guys are put into prison. Right now, they are being victims of systematic killings from the police. So that is also an important difference right now.
Oh yeah, and the police talk about the profiling pretty openly for a couple of profiling of young men based off of skin color and having. I mean, it's starting to sound a little bit like the discourse in El Salvador, even though the situation is very different in Venezuela. But in terms of talking about skin color, with the way that men are dressed, tattoos, things like that, because of some of the different policies that have occurred between what we call like carceral punitive period to the systematic killing period, there's a lot of pressure on police officers to bring in a certain number of bodies every week. And so in order to be able to do that, you need profile that exacerbates the profiling, obviously.
Gamer Ávila has a great piece in Nueva Sociedad.
Exactly. He works with us.
Well, thank you so much for all the amazing questions. That was such a fantastic conversation. And thank you for being here. Gracias, Verónica.
Gracias, Rebecca, gracias.
We're going to have an online event on what is happening in Brazil on Wednesday at 5 p.m. And then we have a talk on Peru. When is the talk? September 29th. That will be in person. Dr. Carlos Merenda. And it's communism by surprise.